Kathleen Esser, a speaker of English, French and Mauritian Creole. Today she will be discussing the Creole language, a topic close to her culture and heart. Please welcome her to the stage.
Thank you. Let's see if I'm clicking the right thing. It's not working. Yes, it's working. All right. Okay. Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to speak to you about Creole languages, and as Lucy said, one of the reasons is I speak a Creole language. I speak Mauritian Creole. So I'll be talking about why Creole languages should be considered, yes, should be considered as languages for the future. There are many definitions out there, and I can't name all of them, but we'll get a stick for the purpose of this talk with when a pigeon is compared to a Creole. Unlike a pigeon, a Creole can be used to meet all communicative needs in all situations. And we're just going to stick with that one for the purpose of this talk. So, how are Creole languages formed? In a basic way, there is a dominant language that dominated groups of people restructure, and this is how Creoles are born. And for this talk, I'm going to focus on 3 areas to bring my point across. The first one is, how are those Creole languages perceived amongst its speakers, and how are they used? The second part is, how difficult or not is it to learn them? And the third area will be what history tells us about Creole languages. So, this is a snapshot of what I would call why most of the misunderstandings occur. First thing is, Creole languages are seen mainly, if not only, unfortunately mostly by the speakers themselves, as being derived from or simplified versions of main languages like English, French and Spanish. Linguists put them into 3 categories: an acrolect Creole, which is when the Creole does not deviate significantly from the main language; a basilec is when it does deviate significantly from the main language; and a mesolec will be the one in between. So essentially they are lexiphied languages because their grammatical structure is that of another language. So that's why it's seen as a weak language by most people. But I'm here to tell you that that is what constitutes their very strength. And that's why we should consider them as a potential candidate for a language to communicate in the future. So in doing lots of research about it, I found that a research from a guy called Farraklas, he talks about how for Creole speakers, communication takes precedence over correctedness. And by correctedness, he means grammatical correctedness. He says that in his research, he observed many cases of when Creole speakers communicate with each other, they are concerned about one thing: getting the message across. Not how well, which words they are using, as long as they're being understood and the people who they work with can understand them, let's work together, let's collaborate. Mufwene, whose research I delved into a bit, talks about the same thing. It's an interesting scenario in his research when he takes the case of Haiti and Jamaica. And he says that English is learned and spoken by a minority in those cultures, and then you use it for work purposes. And when they go back to their country, or when they go back to their local village, if they work there, they speak Creole. One of the reasons is because it's their local language and they can connect with it better, but also because they favor the idea that through Creole language, they are able to communicate more easily and more freely. It's easier to get the message across in their local Creole. The second argument revolves around the language itself, right? So I don't know how much or not you've heard about Creole languages, but how easy or difficult are they to learn really? Too many things to say, again, but one of the quotes that I bumped into that I think summarizes it pretty nicely is by those two people, Alfred and Auguste de Saint-Quentin, when they say that a Creole is a spontaneous, hasty, unconscious product of the human mind, freed from any intellectual culture. For this reason, it would be remarkable to find anything but a confused collection of deformed French phrases, right? But when one studies its structure, one is charmed and surprised to find rigor and simplicity. So he says, I wonder if the collective and creative genius of the most knowledgeable linguists would have been able to come up with such a language that so completely reaches its goal, that requires so little stress and strain on the memory, and only after a few days of study, you are basically able to communicate using the language. Just going to leave you with that. The third point is about my story. So like I said, I am Mauritian and I speak a Creole. And after more than a decade, I decided to go back to Mauritius. And on the plane itself, I heard so many words and expressions I had never heard before. So what happened? It reminded me how dynamic my Creole language is. Actually, any Creole language is. And one of the research that I found done by Muskin and Smith, two linguists, they acknowledge that. They acknowledge the fact that Creole languages evolve all the time. The lexicon changes and varies constantly. And how is that? They don't need to ask permission to anyone to use a new word or an expression. How are they born? Out of a context. You're having a conversation. You can't think of a word that really describes what you're thinking, and you just make up a word. You just make up an expression. No one tells you, hold on a second, what do you mean? No, the context gives meaning to what you're saying. So it's a language that is not bound by time, that evolves constantly. It's pretty exciting. Well, I think so. So the fourth argument is history. If we are to consider anything, a language, as a possible means to communicate in the future, we need to look at what history tells us, to see what is actually our starting point, and to ask ourselves a question, well, why is it not the case if it's so great, right? So back in the 16th century, Creole did not emerge as a linguistic term, as we're talking about it right now. It was a geopolitically rooted classificatory label that emerged in the midst of European imperialism. Essentially what I'm saying is they were ranked from the start as inferior to European languages. That was the starting point. That's one of the reasons that makes it so difficult even for ex-speakers to get out of this mindset. In the 19th century, two linguists, two researchers, one by the name of Lucien Adam and the other one by Julien Vizon, both were of the same mind that Creole speakers, African speakers, their minds were too primitive. That's the word they use, primitive, to understand European languages. They could not possibly comprehend the complexity of any European language. They're mostly talking about French. But I reckon they did something better, ingenious. They did not reproduce a language they heard, they invented one. That's much cooler than reproducing a language, right? So I'm here to say that what the slaves did, it was mostly the slaves, they freed the languages they heard from the grammatical shackles that they were bound to. And on that note, let's get something right. Creole languages are lexicon languages. Yes, their base comes from French, English, or Spanish, but they are a language of their own. They are independent. They do not need any of the three I mentioned to exist. Typologically, they are different. It is proven, all the evidence out there shows that Creole languages are typologically different from non-Creole languages. They represent their own unique stories, cultures, and histories. So, if we were to look at them objectively and consider them as a language to learn, to communicate with one another, we cannot and we should not compare them to any of the languages out there, because it simply cannot be so. If we choose to do so, that means we are, instead of taking a step forward with 2 feet, we're just putting 1 foot forward and the other foot just stuck in history. And we're refusing to acknowledge all the bias and misunderstanding that surrounded those languages for so long. So, why is all this important? We all want to be able to communicate with one another across the world, right? That's one of the reasons why we aim to learn 1, 2, 3, as many languages as we want. So I'm here to tell you that there is one language that we can all consider. One language that's been so long been put aside for all the reasons that I just shared with you. So why not look into it? Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for increasing our awareness on Creole languages and sharing your views and thoughts with us all today.